And thank you all for coming to this session, the final session of the day, about Karl Marx, Then and Now, presented by this panel made up of Caitlin Bundock, Molly Schiffer, Carly Regina, Samantha Stauffer, and William Moran. If you would just please give them all your attention, and you guys can go. Thank you.
Okay, so our presentation is about the perceptions and applications of Marxist theory in the US. Okay, Marxism has a long and controversial history within the US. There are times where Marx has been associated with fear and panic, and not that many times where it's been associated with good. So this reactivity has led to many misperceptions of Marxism today in the US.
So what we're going to be talking about today is, first of all, a Marxist theory overview, just so that everybody has a little bit of an idea of what Marx's central ideas are. Next, we'll be talking about Marx's life and work, just some key events. We'll also be discussing Marxism throughout history, and specifically the civil rights movement. And then we'll be exploring how it can be applied and how it's viewed today with discussion of the economic crisis, as well as Obama. And then we're going to discuss what the main portion of our project was, which was completing a survey of the NAU community to look at the perceptions of Marxism now.
So, Marxist theory is pretty complex, but I've made a few points just to try to get you guys into it. Marx believes that everything, including history, has a foundation of class struggle. Nothing just happens. It happens because two groups are struggling against each other. The struggle is between capitalists and the working class, or sense feudalism. That's what's been happening, according to Marx. Wage labor jobs create alienation or a separation from everything human. So those jobs where at factory workers is what he's mainly talking about in the 1850s. But you're working for a wage, and you also have no control over the means of production. You have no control over your hours, what you do, and it takes away the creativity that makes us human. So in his mind, communism is the end all. There's no more class struggle, and it's just the end where there's equality. And he doesn't believe that you can just get to communism really easily. He believes that a radical revolution is the only way to possibly get to that form of government.
Okay, Marx was born on May 5th, 1818, in what is now Western Germany. He went to high school in his hometown of Trier, and went to the University of Berlin, where he studied law, philosophy, history, and English and Italian languages. In 1841, he received his doctorate and returned to Bonn, which is where he started his college, and hoped to pursue teaching. But the reactionary policy of the government prevented him from doing that. When he was 23, he began writing for a newspaper in opposition to the government, and this is where he met Friedrich Engels for the first time. So after he met Engels, he married his childhood friend Jenny and had 7 children. Unfortunately, only 3 of their children lived to adulthood. In the fall of 1843, Marx moved to Paris, where he began working on his first serious work on Marxism, which was the German ideology. And throughout the 1840s, Marx and Engels were active in revolutionary groups in Paris. In 1845, Marx was banished from Paris because the government considered him too revolutionary. And so he moved to Brussels, where he continued writing. And in 1848, the Communist Manifesto was published in London. Later in 1848, he was banished from Belgium and moved to Germany, where he was soon banished from as well, and then settled in London until his death. He was involved in founding the International Working Men's Association in 1864, which was basically the Marx organization. And in 1867, he published his first volume of Capital and published 2 more volumes by 1880. And then in 1881, his wife died, and 2 years later, Marx died as well from ill health.
Okay, and I'm going to talk about the revolutionary roots of the civil rights movement. I'm going to start with the pre-civil rights movement, and I'd like to share the following poem from Langston Hughes. It's titled, "If You Would," and it says, "You could stop the factory whistleblowing, stop the mine machinery from going, stop the atom bombs exploding, stop the battleships from loading, stop the merchant ships from sailing, stop the jailhouse keys from turning. You could if you would." Now this quote in and of itself is not necessarily communist because it doesn't talk about the workers actually seizing the means of production for their own use, but it does note the fact that the capitalist class is really dependent on the working class, whereas nowadays we often hear that the worker is dependent on the capitalist and his capital and his machinery or his computers at work, whereas the source of all the capitalist profits are in fact from the worker. Another thinker, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who's also associated with black civil rights and the movement for equality, was in fact a member of the Communist Party in 1961 at the age of 93. And he also spoke very favorably of the concept of communism. And you can see it in the ideas that he linked the exploitation of the working class black people in the United States and black people in general to the quarrels and the issues in Africa and how people in Africa and all over the world have been exploited by capitalism. Now Malcolm X once said, "You show me a capitalist and I'll show you a racist." Now that might shock most people here. Everybody here would probably think, hey, I probably have some investments. I have no ill will towards people of other colors, so that might shock most of us. But if you think about what he's saying, you can kind of understand that the capitalist system itself is rooted on slave labor, colonial labor. That was the primitive accumulation that we see leveraged nowadays, held over the working class. That's why the capitalist has the machinery. Most people are probably familiar with the phrasing, old Southern money. That's slave money. That's slave money that's used in new industries now. And so that's a major disadvantage. Stokely Carmichael, one of the authors of Black Power, was also, I'm sorry about that, was also a proponent of communism. He had said that capitalism is a stupid system, a backward system. And in reading the book Black Power, he talks about the black community in Tuskegee, Alabama, home of the Tuskegee Institute, and he talks about how there's this culture that politics and even business is white man's business. And so he talks about how in Tuskegee, Alabama, even once they acquired the vote, they made up 80% of the voting electorate, they still voted for white people, for white candidates, even though there were black candidates running. And so the book Black Power talks about both economic liberation from the capitalist system, but also seizing the means of policy production and how essential that is. And to contrast that a little bit, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he actually went towards communism towards the end of his life, but you hear usually about him more along the lines of this quote, where he says, "What I'm saying to you this morning is that communism forgets that life is individual. Capitalism forgets that life is social."